So we finished chapter 3. Remember, chapter 3 is about the main topic is about comparative advantage. And how do you define comparative advantage? Well, you will define comparative advantage using opportunity cost, right? Basically, if a person has a lower basically if a person has a lower opportunity cost in producing some product, then we would say this person has comparative advantage in this product. So this implies specialization, right? That is, we want the person with a lower comparative advantage. So basically, we want the person with a higher comparative advantage to focus on producing certain product. So the example is, in this example, we talked about the rancher and farmer, right? Basically, you're given a table which gives you some productivity numbers. So, for example, this gives you the productivity of the farmer and the rancher. And interestingly, from this table, you can see that the rancher actually has absolute advantages in both producing meat and producing potatoes, right? Because this person has a higher productivity than farmer in both productions. However, we also know that what to specialize does not depend on absolute advantage. So we basically need to calculate farmer and rancher's opportunity cost, right? So this is the table which gives you the opportunity cost. And after comparing opportunity cost, we find out the rancher actually has lower opportunity cost in producing meat. So the rancher has a comparative advantage in producing meat. And the farmer has the comparative advantage in producing potatoes. So basically, we would let the rancher to focus on producing meat and farmer to focus on producing potatoes. And in the end, the total production will increase and both the farmer and rancher will be better off through trading with each other. And we also discussed several points about this comparative advantage result. The first is we talked about the price of the trade, right? So basically, we know that the price of the trade has to be smaller than buyer's opportunity cost and higher than seller's opportunity cost. And we also talked about an important result. So let me find out where is this. So the second result is about this. It is impossible for one person to have a comparative advantage in both goods, right? So this is true in the case of rancher and farmer. We find out if the rancher has the comparative advantage in producing meat, then it must be true that the farmer has the comparative advantage in producing potatoes. Okay, so let's look at the true-false problems. If it takes Canadian workers fewer hours to produce every good than it takes German workers, then Canada cannot gain from trade with Germany. If you look at the first half of this sentence, you would notice that this part talks about absolute advantage, right? So basically, it says Canadian workers have absolute advantage over German workers. However, the benefit of trade does not depend on absolute advantage. So this is false. Jonathan can make a birdhouse in 3 hours. He can make a bird feeder in 3 hours. The opportunity cost of Jonathan making a birdhouse is 1/3 bird feeder. Well, this is pretty simple, right? Because it says this guy can make a birdhouse using 3 hours. And with the same 3 hours, this guy could make a bird feeder, which means if he decides to make a birdhouse, he has to give up making a bird feeder. So basically, the opportunity cost of making a birdhouse is 1 bird feeder, right? So you should choose false. Trade is based on absolute advantage. Well, we talked about this several times. Obviously, this is not true. Trade is based on comparative advantage. Fourth, unless two people who are producing two goods have exactly the same opportunity costs, each will have a comparative advantage in different goods. This is correct, right? Because we just think about the example of the farmer and rancher, right? We find out if the rancher has a comparative advantage in producing meat, then the farmer must have a comparative advantage in producing potatoes. So this basically means each person will have a comparative advantage in different goods. Now, if you look at the first half of this sentence, right, it says, two people who are producing two goods have exactly the same opportunity cost, right? We have this unless here. This basically means that if two people, they have the exact same opportunity cost, then they will have the same comparative advantages in both goods, which is very easy to understand because they have the same opportunity cost. However, if they don't have the same opportunity costs, then each of them will have a comparative advantage in a different good. So for this fourth problem, you should choose true here. Trade allows a country to continue to consume outside of its production possibilities frontier. This is true. To see this, we could go back to our lecture 3 lecture note, and what you can see here is, okay, so you can see here in the case of the farmer, right? Before specialization in trade, the farmer could only consume at point A, which is exactly on this production's possibilities frontier. Right? However, you can observe that after specialization in trade, what you can see here is the farmer will be able to consume at A star. And obviously, A star is outside of the farmer's production possibilities frontier. Of course, here we are talking about a person, but you will get the same result when you're talking about a country. So basically, for a country, through specialization and trade, a country can actually consume outside of its frontier. So here we should choose true here for the fifth true-false question. Now, sixth, Rusty can edit 2 pages in 1 minute, and it can type 80 words in 1 minute. Emily can edit 1 page in 1 minute, and can type 100 words in 1 minute. Rusty has the absolute and comparative advantage in editing, and Emily has the absolute and comparative advantage in typing. So let's check these numbers, right? So about editing. So what we can see here is Rusty can edit 2 pages in 1 minute, but Emily can only edit 1 page in 1 minute. So this implies Rusty is more productive in editing pages. So Rusty does have an absolute advantage in editing. What about the comparative advantage? Well, you can see that here if Rusty decides to edit 2 pages, he has to give up 80 words. So the opportunity cost for Rusty is 40 words per page, right? What about Emily? Well, this is easy. Emily's cost is 100 words per page. So this implies Rusty does have a comparative advantage in editing. And because Rusty has a comparative advantage in editing, then Emily will have a comparative advantage in typing. What about Emily's absolute advantage? Well, you can see that Emily can type 100 words, but Rusty can only type 80 words. So Emily is more productive in typing. This implies Emily has a absolute advantage in typing. Right? So the sixth statement is correct. When each person specializes in producing the good for which he or she has a comparative advantage, each person can gain from trade, but total production in the economy is unchanged. So here you can see that this is actually in this statement here is actually false. Why it is false? Because this part is not correct, and each person can gain from trade is actually correct. Right? So the statement total production in the economy is unchanged is incorrect. You can see this from the rancher and farmer example. So if you, I think we have a table. So let me look for the table. So you can see that previously, without trade, the productions were like this. And after specialization and trade, we could see a increase in consumption. So essentially it means that the total production of meat and the total production of potatoes, they both have increased, right? So this implies you should choose false for this seventh statement. As long as two people have different opportunity costs, each can gain from trade by being able to obtain a good at a price lower than his or her opportunity cost. Well, this is true, right? The reason why people would trade with each other is because there is benefit from trade. Now, how do you get the benefit from trade? Well, essentially it means if you're the buyer, you could buy at a lower price than your opportunity cost, right? And if you're a seller, then you can sell at a higher price than your opportunity cost. So that's why you would decide to become a seller. Okay. Ninth, the producer who has the smaller opportunity cost of producing a product is said to have an absolute advantage in producing that good. Well, obviously this definition here is incorrect, right? Because you're measuring the cost of production using opportunity cost. And we know that this is related to comparative advantage. Right? So this is false. Two countries can achieve gains from trade even if one country has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. This is true, right? Again, think about the farmer and rancher example. Rancher has both. Rancher has advantage. Sorry, rancher has absolute advantage in both meat and potatoes. But however, you can see that in the end, through specialization and trade, then both people will actually be better off, right? Again, this is about people. And the same result will hold for countries. So you should choose true for this 10th problem. It takes Russell 6 hours to produce a bushel of corn and 2 hours to wash and polish a car. It takes Wilma 6 hours to produce a bushel of corn and 1 hour to wash a car. Wilma and Russell cannot gain from specialization and trade, since it takes each of them 6 hours to produce 1 bushel of corn. So let's just start with these numbers, right? So Russell needs 6 hours to produce corn and 2 hours to wash and polish a car. So what is the opportunity cost of corn? So essentially, with 6 hours, Russell can wash 3 cars. So the opportunity cost is washing 3 cars for 1 bushel of corn. Okay. What about Wilma? So Wilma needs 6 hours to produce corn and 1 hour to wash a car. So the opportunity cost is washing 6 cars for 1 bushel of corn. Okay. So what I can see here is Russell actually has lower opportunity cost in producing corn. Basically, this implies that because Russell has the comparative advantage in corn, then we should let Russell to focus on to specialize in producing corn, right? So basically, you can see that you should choose false here. Generally, if you see a problem, it says you cannot gain from specialization and trade. Generally, most of the time, this statement is wrong. And you can see that the calculation here is, the reason here is also not correct, right? Because whether you would need specialization really depends on comparative advantage. That is the opportunity cost of production. So here, taking 6 hours to produce 1 bushel of corn really is about their productivity in producing corn. And we know that productivity is just related to absolute advantage. And absolute advantage is not related to specialization and trade. 12. Trade allows a person to obtain goods at prices that are less than the person's opportunity cost, because each person concentrates on the activity for which he or she has the lower opportunity cost. So this is correct, right? This also explains why specialization based on opportunity cost actually makes sense, right? Because through this comparative advantage, through this specialization trade, right, each person will focus on the activity for which she has a lower opportunity cost. And if you're focusing the production with a lower opportunity cost, then both people, right, in the economy will be able to buy consumption goods at a lower price compared with their opportunity costs. Okay, 13. For a country producing 2 goods, the opportunity cost of 1 good will be the inverse of the opportunity cost of the other good. Well, this is true, right? We have learned about this. If you look at chapter 3, so let's look at farmer and ranchers opportunity cost. So what you can see here is, let's say farmers' opportunity cost of producing 1 meat is 4 kg potatoes, right? And you can see that the farmer's opportunity cost of producing 1 kg of potatoes is just 1/4 kg of meat, right? So 4 and 1/4, they're inverse with each other. What about a rancher? It's the same thing, right? So here you have 2, and here you have 1/2. Again, inverse with each other. And for this problem, you could also use the you could also use the production possibilities frontier, we discussed in lecture, I think we discussed this in the first lecture. So let's say you have two products, right? You have apple and orange. So let's say you move from, so here we have one apple, and here we have three apple. Here we have one orange, and we have two orange here. So you can see that if you move from A to B, right? What happens is you have to, so if you move from A to B, you have to give up what? Well, you have to give up orange, right? You have to give up one orange. And you would gain two apples. So this essentially implies the opportunity cost of producing orange is two apple, right? One orange. So this is your opportunity cost of producing one orange. Now let's see the other case. Let's say if you go from B to A, right? What would happen is you will actually give up two apples, and you will gain one orange. So in this case, you can see that your opportunity cost of producing apple is 1/2 orange, right? Because here you would give up two apple and gain one orange, right? So you can see that these numbers, they're inverse with each other. Okay, the last true-false question. It takes Barbara 3 hours to make a pie and 4 hours to make a shirt. It takes Gary 2 hours to make a pie and 5 hours to make a shirt. Barbara should specialize in making shirts, and Gary should specialize in making pies. Then they should trade. This is the very basic format of thinking about comparative advantage, right? What you need to do is you want to look at these numbers and calculating their opportunity cost. Then you would start to deciding their comparative advantage, right? So if the first person needs 3 hours to make a pie and 4 hours to make a shirt. So this basically implies that if Barbara decides to make a pie, then she needs to give up 3 hours. With this 3 hours, she actually could make 3/4 shirt, right? So the opportunity cost of making one pie is 3/4 shirt. What about Gary? Well, Gary, to make a pie, Gary needs to give up 2 hours. With this 2 hours, Gary can actually make 2/5 shirt, right? So Gary's opportunity cost of making one pie is 2/5. So basically 3/4 is 0.75, right? 2/5 is 0.4. So you can see that who has a lower opportunity cost to make pie? Well, it's pretty easy, right? You can see that Gary, this guy, actually has a lower opportunity cost. So Gary has a comparative advantage in making a pie. This means Gary should specialize in making pies. And if Gary has a comparative advantage in making pies, then Barbara will have a comparative advantage in making shirt. Right? So this statement here is correct. Okay, great. Now let's move on to chapter 9. Chapter 9 discusses about international trade. And The foundation to understand chapter 9 is from all our previous lectures. So basically, we would actually think about comparative advantage, right? Because when you're talking about international trade, you cannot avoid thinking about comparative advantage. And we also will examine a specific economic policy. That is, we will consider how tariff would affect international trade. Obviously, tariff is a type of tax. So essentially, we will examine how a tax will affect consumer surplus and producers surplus. Right. So, what we have learned, total surplus. Well, I think we basically discussed how tax will affect total surplus, right? So, what we have learned from that chapter would be useful in this chapter when we think about the effect of tariff on total surplus. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so we will first start with a more basic section, which discusses the determinants of trade, and we will start with a very cute story. So let's say we have a country which is called Iceland, right? Obviously, Iceland means it's a isolated land, right? So if it's called Iceland, you would expect, at least in the beginning, there was no international trade, right? Because it is isolated. So to be more specific, we are examining its textile market. And we start with the case of no international trade. So it is isolated from the outside world. Now, first, let's think about the case when there was no international trade. And to be more specific, we want to think about the market equilibrium and total surplus. And after all those chapters, right, you could see that this is a very simple case. Because you can see basically if you are given the demand curve, right, and supply curve, then you should be able to find out the market equilibrium, that is the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. And you should also be able to find out the consumer surplus and producer surplus. So let me remind you, the consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the price. And the producer's surplus is the area between the price and the supply curve. So this essentially means for consumer surplus, you're looking at this top triangle, right? And for producer surplus, you're looking at this bottom triangle. Now let's say this Iceland has a new president, and this president promised to evaluate this country's trade policy, right? So basically, this country wants to do some reforms on international trade. And before starting this reform, the president asks some economists 3 questions. The first is, if we open the market, if we allow Icelandics, right, that is the people living in Iceland. So if we allow Icelandics to import and export textiles, then what would happen to the price of textiles? And what would happen to the quantity of textiles sold in the domestic market? Second, which is a question on welfare. Who would gain from free trade in textiles, and who would lose? And will the gain be larger than the loss? Third, should we impose a tariff on textile imports, right? Again, a tariff is essentially a tax, right? So let's start with the first question, right? How would the domestic market price and domestic quantity would change if international trade is allowed? So first, we will want to compare the domestic price with the world price, right? So what is the world price? So basically, we are thinking about the so let's say this is Iceland, right? So this is Iceland. Let's say it's a small country, and this is the world, right? This is the world, and world has a price, right? So it's the price which prevails in the world market, and Iceland also has a price for textiles. So our first step is we want to compare this world price versus the price in Iceland. Now, think about this. If the domestic price of Iceland on textiles is smaller compared with the world price, what would you expect? You will actually expect that Iceland will become an exporter, right? Think about this. If the domestic market price for textile is just $1, but the world price is $2, then obviously producers in Iceland will be happy to export textiles at a higher price. And other countries will be happy to import textiles from Iceland, right? Now, think about the other case. If the world price is smaller than the domestic price, now you can see that Iceland will become an importer of textile, right? For example, if the world price is $1, but the domestic price is $2, then clearly consumers from the domestic market, they will not be happy to buy textiles at a higher price. So they will just import from the outside world at a lower price, right? And what is this result, or how is this result related to comparative advantage? Well, think about this. What is a domestic price? Well, domestic price in Iceland actually reflects the opportunity cost of textiles, right? So basically, if the domestic price is smaller compared with the world price, it basically implies that Iceland has a comparative advantage in producing textiles. So in this case, Iceland should specialize in producing textiles and become an exporter of textiles. However, if the world price is smaller compared with the domestic price, this essentially means the opportunity cost of producing textiles is too high in Iceland. So Iceland does not have a comparative advantage in producing textiles. This implies the outside world should specialize in producing textiles, and Iceland should import from the outside world. Right? So you can see that the importer and exporter, right? This role is actually related to comparative advantage. Okay. Okay. Now, let's think about the second question. That is the winners and losers from international trade. That is how social welfare, how consumer surplus and producer surplus will change because of the international trade, right? So, to analyze this question, to answer this question, we wanted to assume that Iceland is a small economy compared with the outside world. What's the implication here means? Well, it means that the country Iceland will take the world price as given, right? So this also implies Iceland's trade policy will not affect the world price. Essentially, this implies Icelandians are just price takers. They will take the world price as given. And you can see that this assumption of price takers is only true when you're assuming a small economy, right? Because you're small, so your policy will naturally not affect the world price. However, if you're a very large country, say if you're a US or if you're a China, in this case, your trade policy will definitely change world price. Okay, let's see what happens, right, if the country becomes a exporter. First, from this picture, you can see that the domestic price, which is given by this dashed line, right? So this is the domestic price. It is smaller compared with the world price. So naturally, Iceland, in this case, should become a exporter. Right? Now, how the price will change? You can see that after Iceland decides to become an exporter, the price will increase from the dashed line to this red line, right? That is, the domestic price in Iceland will be the same as the world price after Iceland decides to become an exporter. Right? I mean, this is obvious because think about this. If you're a producer, if you know you can sell at the world price, you would never sell at the domestic price, which is lower, right? So obviously, the world price and the domestic price will both be equal to the world price after the international trade starts. Now, what about quantity? Well, what you can see here is previously, the equilibrium was given by the point D here, right? And after the country becomes an exporter, we will actually have two quantities, right? So let's call this as Q1. This is Q2. What is Q1? Q1 is quantity supplied by producers, right? By Iceland producers. What is Q2? Q2 is actually quantity demanded by Iceland buyers, right? And you can see that Q1 is actually larger than Q2. So here you can see that quantity supplied by Iceland producers is not equal to quantity demanded by Iceland buyers. Why do we get this result? Well, it's very natural because Q1 minus Q2 is just the quantity exported, right? So it's just quantity exported to the world market. Okay, we have discussed price and quantity. Now let's discuss how total surplus will change, right? So to do this, let's start with the simple case of no trade, right? And then, okay, let me make this table better. So we will think about total surplus and, I should start with consumer surplus. So we will look at consumer surplus and producer surplus. What else? Well, tax revenue, right? Because, we have not discussed tariff yet, so I should not talk about tax revenue here. There is no tax revenue. So we have consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. So let's first start with the simple case. That is without trade. So there's no trade. And then we will discuss the case with trade. Then we will look at the change in consumer surplus and producer surplus and total surplus. Okay, that's great. So without trade, consumer surplus is just given by A and B, right? So A plus B. Right, A plus B. And without trade, producer surplus is given by C. So total surplus is obviously A plus B plus C. This is easy. Now, what about the case with trade? With trade, the consumer surplus is just A, right? You can see that it's the area between the red curve, which is the world price, and the demand curve. Now, what about producer's surplus? Remember, producer surplus is the area between world price and supply curve. So here you can see that producer surplus is given by B, C, D, right? So total surplus would be A plus B plus C plus D. Now what about the change? Well, you can see that after the trade, consumer surplus decreases by B, and producer surplus increases by B plus C. So it's not B plus C, it's actually B plus D, right? Increases by B plus D. So what's the total change? It's a positive D, right? Now let's focus on these three numbers, right? What can you see here? Well, okay, so these three numbers. What can you see here is after the country becomes a exporter, consumer surplus decreases, right? So the first result is consumer surplus decreases. So consumer surplus decreases. Now, what about producer's surplus? So producer surplus increases. What about total surplus? Total surplus increases. So to summarize, when a country allows trade and becomes the exporter of a product, right? Domestic producers will be better off because they have a higher producer surplus, and domestic consumers will be worse off. They're having a lower consumer surplus. However, the total surplus increases, right? So this implies that the gains, that is the increase in producer surplus, is larger than the decrease in the consumer surplus, which means for international trade, the gains of the winners exceed the losses of the losers. And you can see that in the case of becoming an exporter, who are the winners here? Well, producers, right? And who are the losers here? Consumers. Now, let's consider the other case. Let's say the domestic price before trade is actually higher than the world price, right? And what you can see here is if domestic price was higher than the world price, the country will become a importer, right? Because it's cheaper to make your purchase from the outside world. And how would the domestic price and domestic quantities change? Well, you can see that the domestic price will decrease to the world price, right? So the domestic price will decrease to the world price. What about quantity? And again, you can see that we will have three quantities, right? So let's call this as Q. Okay, I'll call this as QD. This as QS, and this as Q. So QD is larger than Q, is larger than QS. QD is really the quantity demanded by consumers or domestic consumers. And QS is really the quantity supplied by the domestic suppliers. And you can see that QD is larger than QS because part of the consumption is from imported textiles, right? So you can see that QD minus QS essentially equals quantity imported. Okay, that's for price and quantity. So now let's discuss how consumers' welfare will change and producers' welfare will change, right? So we will follow the same format. So we will discuss consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus. And we will discuss without trade and with trade, and we will look at changes, right? So without trade, consumer surplus is given by A. And without trade, producer surplus is given by B and C. So again, total surplus is A, B, and C. What about the case when there is trade? So you can see here, with trade, the price drops to the world price, right? So consumer surplus now is given by A plus B plus D. Producer surplus will be suppressed to C. So the total surplus with trade is A plus B plus C plus D. Now what about the changes? You can see that the consumer surplus will change by B plus D, and producer surplus would be decreased by B. So the total change would be an increase, which is measured by D, right? So what can you see here? Well, essentially what can you see here is consumer surplus will increase and producer surplus will decrease and total surplus will increase, right? Well, the result that consumer surplus increases is very easy to understand, right? Because we have learned in previous lecture notes, if price decreases, then consumer surplus should increase and producer surplus should decrease, right? So here, this is exactly the case. The interesting result is the total surplus will actually increase, right? So let's summarize the finding here. When a country allows trade and becomes a importer, domestic consumers of the good will be better off, and domestic producers will be worse off, right? That is, consumer surplus will increase and producer surplus will decrease. And the total surplus will increase, right? This basically implies that the gains from the winners exceed the loss of the losers. So here, who are the winners? Consumers, right? Who are the losers? Producers, right? Okay, that's for the second case when the country becomes a importing country. So let's see. Well, you could actually see why do we get this orange triangle as the increase in the total surplus, right? So you can see that this, oops. So you can see that this triangle D is the net increase in total surplus. Why do we have this? Well, the reason is because if you look at D here, what you can see here is this price here, the world price is actually quite low. It is lower compared with these consumers. So if these consumers can make purchase at the world price, then they will actually be better off, right? Okay. Another thing is about explain why international trade policy is always very contentious, right? So you can see that depending on whether you become an importer or exporter, there will always be winners and losers, right? Think about the first case. In the first case, the country becomes an exporter. And in this case, you can see that producers will be winners and consumers will be losers, right? So in this case, you can see that consumers won't be quite happy with the fact that their country become a exporter, right? And you can see that there could be some political debates, some protests, right? And then you can see that in the second case, when the country becomes a importer, in this case, you can see that producers, they will become losers and consumers, they will become winners. So you can see that generally, generally, if a country becomes a importers, there will be a lot of debates. The reason is because if a country becomes a importer, producers, those firms, they will become losers. And generally, firms, they have more political power compared with consumers. So they will actually use a lot of lobbyists, right? They could actually organize some protests. You can actually see this in the trade war, right? You can see that essentially the US becomes a big importer because China has become this, world factory, right? So basically a lot of firms in the US won't be happy with this. So you can see that there were a lot of all kinds of political activities related to this trade war. Okay, I actually have a cute picture here, right? You can see that South Korean farmers protest WTO conference, right, in 2005. Again, farmers are essentially producers, right? So I guess the world price is lower compared with domestic price in South Korea, right? So South Korea would actually import something like rice or corn from the world market. And clearly, South Korean farmers who are the producers, they will suffer from the fact that if South Korea imports rice and corn from the world market, so they would want to protest, right? I mean, the funny thing is generally producers, they like to protest, and we consumers are generally keep silent, right? So that's a fun fact. Now let's look at this simple problem here. So you can see here, without trade, the domestic price for TVs is 3,000, and the world price for TV is 1,500. Under free trade, how many TVs will the country import or export? Identify consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus without trade and with trade. First, you can see that the domestic price is actually higher compared with the world price. So in this case, you can see that this country should become a importer, right? So the country should import TVs. To be more precise, if the world price is 1,500, the quantity imported would be the difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. So it's 600 minus 200. So the answer here is 400 TVs will be imported, right? So it will be imported. Identify consumer surplus with or without trade. Well, this is easy, right? So if there is no trade, consumer surplus is given by this triangle, right? So what is the base here? It's just 400. What is the height? Oh, we actually have a missing number. We don't know what's this number here. Let me see what is this number? Oh, you're not required to actually calculate the consumer surplus. You just need to use these letters. So let's call this triangle as A. Okay, let me follow the answer here. So A, B, C, D. And let me add some colors. So this is A, and this is B, this is C, this is D. Okay, this now becomes very simple, right? So with no trade, CS is A, PS is BC, and TS is obviously ABC, right? And with trade, CS would become ABD, PS would become C. So the total surplus would become ABCD. So this is pretty simple. It's like exactly the same as our lecture note, but you can see that clearly I could make this a little more complicated, right? Let's make this a little bit more complicated. So basically, I could actually put some number here. Let me put a number of, I guess this number is 6,000, right? So if I give you this number, then you should be able to calculate exactly what is the number for consumer surplus, producer surplus, right? Because basically you can see that if you know that consumer surplus is given by A without trade, then you just calculate the area of this triangle A here, right? For example, the area of A is given by the height, which is 3,000, and the base, which is 400, right? So the area of A is 1/2 times 3,000 times 400, so which gives you 60,000, right? Am I right? I think it's 600,000, right? Okay. That's it. Okay, now let's talk about the third topic. That is the effect of a tariff. So, first, what is a tariff? Well, tariff is really just a tax imposed on quantity imported, right? So let's say if you have a $1 tariff and quantity imported is 100 units, then you can see that the total tax revenue from the tariff is just 1 times 100, right? Now we wanted to think about how tariff would affect the total surplus in this isolated country. Obviously, tariff will only matter if Iceland becomes a a textile importer, right? Because if you're exporting something, then your tariff will not be activated. Right? So now let's look at what would happen on price if a tariff is imposed. First, we will only consider the case the country is a importer, right? So in this case, you can see that without tariff, the domestic price will be the same as the world price. Now, what happens if there is a tariff? So if there is a tariff, the domestic price will increase by the amount same as the tariff, right? For example, if the world price is $100 and if the tariff is $10, then after imposing the tariff, then the domestic price in Iceland will increase from 100 to 110, right? Now, what about quantity? Well, it's pretty clear to see what would happen to quantity here, right? You can see that before imposing tariff, the quantity demanded is given by Q1D, and the quantity supplied is given by Q1S. Right? And after imposing the tariff, quantity demanded is given by Q2D. Oops. Right? It is given by Q2D. And quantity supplied is given by Q2S. Now, clearly you can see that Q2D is actually smaller, right, compared with Q1D. Oops. So Q2D is actually smaller compared with Q1D. And Q2S is larger than Q1S. So you can see that with tariff, quantity imported would be smaller. Right? Okay, so we have discussed price and quantity. So let's talk about the important question. That is how consumer surplus and producer surplus would change because of the tariff. Okay, you can see that we have a lot of rectangles and triangles here. So the case with the tariff is more complicated than the case without a tariff. Okay, now let's start with consumer surplus, right? Producer surplus, tax revenue, and total surplus. So we first discussed the case of no tariff. And then we discussed the case with tariff. And then we look at changes. Okay, that's great. Now, without tariff, consumer surplus is given by, well, as I said, we have a lot of shapes here. So it is given by A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F, right? What is producer surplus? It's just G. What is tax revenue? Well, we're discussing the case without tariff. So tax revenue is definitely 0. Now, total revenue would be A to G. Right? Okay, what about the case with tariff? So if there is tariff, you can see that as the price increases, consumer surplus will be smaller, right? To be more specific, it would be just A and B. And what about producer's surplus? Well, producer's surplus would be given by the area between the price and the supply curve. So this is given by C plus G. What about tax revenue? Tax revenue is just the size of the tax, that is tariff, times quantity imported. Quantity imported here is given by Q2D minus Q2S. So you can see that tax revenue is just E here, right? So the total surplus is given by A plus B plus C plus G plus E. Now let's look at changes. You can see that consumer surplus will decrease by C. So it will decrease by C plus D plus E plus F, right? What about producer surplus? It will increase by G. And tax revenue will increase by E. Now what's the total change? The total change is the total surplus will decrease by E and I and F. How do you see this? Well, you would just look at this, this, and this. And if you sum up these three different terms, then you will get minus E minus F. You could also compare the total surplus without tariff and the total surplus with tariff. So you will see that again, the total surplus decreases by G and F. So what's our result here? So you can see that what happens is using tariff, consumer surplus would just decrease, right? So consumer surplus decrease and producer's surplus increases and government tax revenue increases, right? However, importantly, total surplus actually decreases. So who are the winners from a tariff? Producers, and in some sense, the government, right? Who are the losers from a tariff? Consumers, right? And the important thing is the total surplus decreases because of tariff. So what does this mean? It means that the gain from winners is actually smaller compared with the loss from losers, right? Okay. Okay, that's let me see. Okay, that's for that's the discussion on the surplus here. So if we take a closer look at the, oh, sorry, I think I made a mistake. The loss is actually given by D and F, right? Now we take a closer look at the loss resulting from the imposing of a tariff. So you can see that the loss is given by the little triangles, D and F. Now, why do we have D here? So in fact, D is caused by overproduction. So why this is overproduction? Well, the reason is if you look at these guys, if you look at these producers, remember supply curve represents cost of a producer. So you can see that these producers on this section of this curve, they actually have higher cost compared with the world price. So their production is actually inefficient, right? However, because of the tariff, these inefficient firms will actually start producing textiles, right? So this is actually a overproduction. Right? Now what about the triangle F? This is called underconsumption. Right? This is underconsumption. Why this is a underconsumption? Because of the tariff. Well, the reason is because if there was no tariff, these consumers, right, their willingness to pay is higher than the world price. So this implies that if they could make their purchase, there will be some positive consumer surplus. However, because of the tariff, which increases the price in isoland, these consumers on this section, they won't be able to afford this textiles at a higher price. So in this case, this part of consumer surplus will be lost, right? Due to the underconsumption. Okay, great. That's for today's class.